this is a faith-based movement.
Right.
And the faith is that we have inner selves, and those inner selves are sexed, and the sex can be different from the body. But then I keep coming back to the fact that it's a very linguistic movement, and it requires the policing of other people's language. That's why they don't want debate, and that's why they're angry with somebody like me.
Welcome to Parallax Views, an IEA series of conversations about the politics of culture, primarily focusing on freedom of speech. My name is Marc Glendening, and I'm delighted to be discussing the book Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality, with its author, Helen Joyce. Helen is an academic, a mathematician, journalist, with The Economist, amongst other publications. She's also a leading activist in the feminist group Sex Matters. Helen's book is a Sunday Times bestseller and is indispensable if you want to get a grip on the issues surrounding the phenomenon of transgenderism. Can I start, Helen, by asking you to define for us transgenderism and transgender ideology in relation to it?
So funnily enough, I never use the phrase transgenderism in the book, because it's never clear, do you mean somebody who's identifying out of their sex, or do you mean people who have certain thoughts about such identification? So that's why I tend to use theory or ideology for what I'm talking about in the book. I mean, as you know, since you've read it, somewhere around paragraph 8 or 9 in the introduction, I say this is not a book about trans people. And the first sentence of the book is, this is a book about an idea. So transgender ideology or gender identity theory is an idea. And that idea is that what makes us men or women, or what makes us male or female, is not the unalterable fact of our bodies, or what we were conceived as, which evolved group we belong to, male or female. It's something that we think about ourselves, feel about ourselves, say about ourselves. So in that sense, I say in the book that it's something like a sexed soul. So then the ideology that's built on top of that is quite simple, which is, well, it's not simple in its consequences, but it's simple to say. And that is that if somebody says they're a woman, they are a woman. And we do have certain things in the world that are divided between men and women, most obviously intimate spaces, but also sports. And if somebody says they're a woman, they gain access to the women's ones. And if they say they're a man, they gain access to the men's ones. And anyone who says, but hang on a minute, that's not the body I associate with women, or that's not the body I associate with men, is accused of things like biological essentialism or hate speech, really, because I think it's partly what you said. It's about identity. It's about moving away from a communal idea of the world into a very personal idea of what it is to be to be human, to be very self-defined.
And I mean, you have been accused of hate speech, haven't you? Just simply by writing this very temperate book, which may contain ideas some people disagree with, but there's certainly no kind of vitriolic rhetoric in it. So it is quite extraordinary that people are now just habitually described as engaging in hate speech simply by articulating the kind of views you are.
I mean, it is odd, because what I think is what everybody thought until half a minute ago, and still what about 99% of people on the earth think. I've tried it when I was still working at The Economist, because I'm on leave at the moment with Sex Matters, as you mentioned, which isn't a feminist organisation, by the way. It's not that we're not feminists particularly, it's that it's about sex-based rights, which everybody has, male and female. So it's an organisation for everybody.
I see. I stand corrected.
We're more basic even than being feminist. We're just about, there are two sexes, what does that mean for your human rights?
Right, okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so when I was still at The Economist, I was travelling for some reporting in Asia, and I'd got interested. I was writing about banking, as it happens, about personal banking. I was already interested in the topic, so I tried asking people, what do you think of this? It was either impossible to explain to people what I was even asking them, or if I finally managed to get through to them what I was trying to say, the jaws just dropped and they were like, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. It can't be that people think that. So it is odd that something so ordinary and something that we would have no problem in saying about any other species is somehow hate speech now suddenly. I mean, it's a kind of creationism, really, because it's certainly seeing humans as very separate from any other animals. I mean, we're just great apes. We're very closely related to the other great apes. Of course, you know, the sex means the same for us as it does for all the other mammals, but apparently not.
What is strange to somebody sort of coming to this issue relatively recently is the split within the feminist movement, because potentially if you have self-identification in relation to gender stroke sex, then potentially every male could redefine themselves as being female. And that would be an extraordinary thing for people who think of themselves as feminists to accept. Why is it there are some such people who are militantly pro-trans? I mean, they tend to call themselves sort of intersectional feminists.
Or third wave. I mean, feminism, I've always regarded myself as a feminist in the sense that I think women are as good as men, frankly much better, but I'm joking with that bit. But I was never a movement feminist. But within movement feminism, there have always been splits, as I'm sadly discovering right now. So it's not that surprising that there are people within feminism who think of everything differently. And I'm maybe not being very fair to my opponents because, you know, I don't actually understand how they can possibly think what they claim to think, but I'm sure they do. My best explanation is that attempts to free women from unjust rules to do with sex, things like not being allowed to vote, not having property rights, and being subordinate to husbands, that sort of thing. A lot of those unjust rules were naturalised. They were described as being, you know, the order of things, the correct order of things. You know, women were mentally weaker or physically weaker or morally weaker. Their proper place, according to the Bible, was subject to men, that sort of thing. And so women, to argue that they could be on an equal footing to men, had to argue against what was being described as nature. And so then when you say to somebody, you know, it is my nature that I'm female, it's got 2 centuries of echoes for people of, you know, it's my nature that I'm weaker, it's my nature that I'm subordinate, and so on. And then the other thing I would say is that, you know, I didn't really think about this until I had kids, and most people don't. Human female physiology is a tough gig. So in general, animals, I mean, if you look at evolution, you look at evolutionary theory, there are reasons why there are 2 sexes, which we don't need to go into here, and they're mathematical modelling reasons why it's 2. And one of them ends up with larger gametes and fewer of them, and one is smaller gametes and more of them. And that affects a lot of things. And with mammals, where you grow the baby inside you, it affects even more things than it would, say, for fish, right? But humans have really very unusually difficult pregnancies, births, and long child-rearing periods because our babies are born very, very immature because they've got to get out. So all these things like because we stand upright, the pregnancy is difficult, the birth is difficult, you know. Anyway, so we are simultaneously, the 2 most striking things about the animals that we are 1, our brains. We don't feel like we're animals, we feel like we're gods stuck in meat suits. But also, we have this incredibly animalistic function if we're female. The pregnancy and childbirth and the child rearing are not easy. You know, if you look at other apes, they're much, much easier, right? So this is actually really very difficult to come to terms with if you're trying to say how women can be liberated. And the pattern for women's lib has been the man. So women have argued that they are as good as men, and we are as good as men. We're as clever as you, we're many other things like that, but we have this animalistic function that can't be hived off, and that we haven't ever properly incorporated into the way that we organise society or the way that we think about what it is to be human. The pattern for the human is the man. And so all of this means that feminism is still grappling with some quite foundational questions, and they're difficult questions when what you're trying to say to an unreconstructed sexist is I'm as good as you. So I think that's it. I think there's like a foundational problem that we still haven't tackled within feminism. And the result is that when you say anything about biology or anything about nature, people are suspicious. But also, if you say anything about being evolutionarily different, men and women, they're also suspicious. So a friend of mine who's a right-wing woman who doesn't describe herself as a feminist, although she's a notable campaigner on women's rights, she says, the transgender lobby say that, evolution happened from the neck up only. And the feminists say that it happened from the neck down only. So I think we need to get, it's like we need a humanism, actually, within which feminism could sit. So that's maybe a longer and grander answer than you wanted, but I still think about this all the time myself.
Very fascinating. Something else that occurs to me in relation to this is it possible that the transgender ideological militants, so not people
ordinary
who think
people,
of themselves as trans, but the real ideologues at the heart of this, and you'll know much more about them than I will, that actually transgenderism is actually a cover for a more revolutionary ideology, which is not, they're using trans for a more grandiose project, so that the sort of binary opposition of the patriarchy versus women has for them becomes superseded by the conflict between what they would consider to be bourgeois, Western,
basic,
rationalist
what
society,
the kids say basic,
versus the collection of outsider groups that the more contemporary New Left have come to embrace. So their ideology is really about sort of almost culture year zero, about overturning the entirety of the culture, whereas traditional feminists have been about really piecemeal sort of change, demanding very specific reforms that would benefit women. Whereas these people are really about some sort of fundamental, and hence that may also indicate their obsession with children in relation to this, a sort of culture year zero project. I don't know, perhaps I'm going off on one.
No, you've asked me about 5 fascinating questions there, and I don't know which ones to answer. They're all good. Let me see if I can think through that. So I would say, like all really interesting phenomena, there are a lot of different things going on. And I don't think we can step away from the fact that there is a small but non-zero number of powerful men who want more than anything else to count as women. And I think of that as like the nuclear reactor in the movement. Without that, the whole thing would just kind of come to a halt. And for those people, it's not enough that you accommodate them. Like, it's not enough that we say, you can wear what you like, you can do what you like, you can marry who you like.
Because nobody disputes that now.
No, exactly. That's but also that's like pretending, that's going along with, and they don't want going along with. And because, I'm thinking of quite specific people here, and I think probably anyone who's been watching this for a while will be able to think of their own examples. They're often quite notably powerful and forceful men who've done very well and have got what they want in life. They're often like, they've done well in business, they've been very successful and so on. They're not going to take no from anybody. And in particular, they're not going to take no from women on this one. So women really must step into line on this. And so I think that's part of it. And this is by no means all trans people, by any means, really. But, without those people, I think this would not ever have got off the ground.
You're talking about the ideological drivers, not just ordinary trans people.
Frankly, it's not an ideological driver. It's an erotic and personal and intellectual driver. It's something that's core to these people's self-conceptions. And, they're just not going to be happy otherwise. I don't think they're very happy anyway, but they're not going to be happy without that. So I think that's one part. And then I don't think we can either ignore the fact that the sort of the multi-decade move that we've seen, especially on the left, has been towards greater individualism. Much of that is good. Like, too many things were not within people's own control. But there are things that just aren't within our control. Like, it is not within my control to be a totally different person. And that's what this is. This is like saying, I'm able to define myself in all these ways. Well, there's one more way to define myself. And other people saying no to that feels like bigotry. And then the children thing, I think there's a lot there too, but I would say You know, I mentioned the word erotic, I mentioned the elephant in the room. I mean, there's absolutely an erotic drive for some men in particular to present as women. That's their erotic fixation, in fact. And they're in love with the woman they wish to be. And if you don't want to say that, like one of the specialists that I interviewed for the book, he said it very frankly. He said, you know, suppose you've been erotically cross-dressing since your teens, and you're now in your 50s, and this woman is more real to you than anything else, and it's time to be her. And you walk into work and you say, I've been masturbating in my wife's knickers since I got married. It's time to wear them all the time. That's not going to go down well. But if you go in and you say, I have always been a woman inside, and now it's time, I can't hide that fact about me anymore, that fits much better into this long-run history of, black liberation, women's liberation, gay liberation.
Yeah, I see. So it's got jumping on this much more respectable...
but also a strong feeling of progress, the sort of arc of progress bends slowly, but, that sort of thing. It feels like part of that, even though it's a very different thing. So then what do you have to say and do to make that plausible, that actually there's a woman inside and that's the real person that you are? Because it's a very bizarre claim. Well, you have to have always been that way. And if you've always been that way, then there are children who are trans.
Right.
So there have got to be people born this way, and that's children. And that contradicts what we already knew about how people develop a transgender identity. It's not something you're born with. Like, people tend to think, oh, there's probably a bit of your brain, you've probably got a lady brain in a man body or something. There's no evidence of that. In fact, there's evidence that it's not true. And the thing is that men's and women's brains are a bit different, and in fact gay people's brains and straight people's brains are a little bit different.
In what ways?
There's just some really small parts of the brain that you can see. I just mean statistically. Like, our brains are not the most different bit about us by any means, but statistically there are some differences. There aren't between trans people and non-trans people once you control for sexual orientation. So it isn't that it's your brain, right. Okay? And if you look back at sort of the 70 or 80 years that doctors have been seeing people who come in and say, I was meant to be a woman, or I was meant to be a man, or whatever, if they're children, they tend to grow out of it. Like 80 to 90% grow out. And it happens around puberty, and it happens mostly because they say, oh, I'm gay. Because there's a strong link between being quite non-conforming for your sex in early childhood and growing up to be gay. Like, we've known that for a long time. Like, every homophobe knows it. Like, every dad who wants to, beat the sissiness out of his sissy little boy because he wants him to grow up straight knows it. And yet it's become a kind of an unmentionable thing. I don't quite know why, because it's really very obvious once you look, if you know children. But those kids now think of themselves as trans, and they often before would too. They'd wonder, like, why am I like this? Like, especially if they've got a very traditional, rigid family that's trying to push them into traditional sex roles. So you have a little boy who wants a Barbie and doesn't like, cries at the idea of playing rugby and so on. And if he's told he's a sissy, take away the doll, no, you're not allowed to wear a skirt, at some point the idea occurs to that poor child, why am I like this? I wish I was a girl. Maybe I was meant to be a girl. So
and of course that's now being encouraged actively by mermaids. And
exactly. So those kids, they popped up. They always popped up. And as soon as gender clinics saw kids, there were very few of them, but they used to see them, and they just tracked them. And what happened was those boys in their teens went, oh, now I know I'm different, I'm gay. That was the overwhelming thing that happened. So no, there aren't trans kids. We know that. And yet there must be.
But they're being encouraged to believe they are.
Yes.
And so you're getting a sort of, in a way, another form of gay conversion therapy, aren't you?
I think it's the most straightforward form of gay conversion therapy. It's a conversion therapy on the body. You turn a perfectly normal, healthy gay person into a sterile because, this treatment pathway sends you on the way to sterility. A sterile, pretend straight person of the opposite sex.
Mm. What are the implications of the creation of a human right to be recognised as whatever sex you want to be recognised as? I mean, for example, does it open the door also to the idea of transracialism? Could I redefine myself as a person of colour? Does it could it lead potentially to people demanding to be recognised as OAPs when they're in their 20s? I mean, I know this sounds kind of Daily Mail cheap shot
people have
stuff.
tried it.
Or maybe, I mean, in the book you refer to transhumanism, which you might... I was reading about a family called the Pritzkers, who are very big in Democratic Party politics in Illinois, billionaires, and they're sort of putting in lots of money to the creation of synthetic sex identities. I mean, it sounds like something out of a science fiction kind of horror movie. They're putting money into some quite sort of sinister sounding kind of experimentation, and particularly geared to young people again. I mean, do you know anything about that?
Jennifer Pritzker is a trans woman, and that is one of the people who has pushed very hard for his gender self-ID. I don't know more than that on the Pritzker family, but when you think, like, this is somebody who was a man, and until in his 50s, he identified as a man. He was quite successful. He was in the army.
And is he biologically a man now?
Yeah. You can't change your sex, so he's biologically a man, but he identifies
had the operation,
I don't know, but it still doesn't change your sex.
No, of course not.
Castration does not turn a man into a woman. And there's another trans woman, another successful person in the pharma industry called Martine Rothblatt, who has written the book called From Transgender to Transhuman. So I don't need to make the link. The link's there, I mean, what happens if you call it a human right to be able to identify as something you're not? What I contend in the book is that it pops up in lots of places. The problem pops up in lots of places. Because there aren't that many places where it matters what sex people are in an ordinary, everyday world. Like, it doesn't matter what sex anybody sitting here is, or what sex you are and I are. We're just talking to each other, although we both know what sex the other person is. And each of us, if we look around, we can see what sex everybody is. It doesn't matter. It matters when you're deciding, who to have sex with or marry. It matters when you're going to get undressed. It matters if you want to get medical treatment. It matters in prison. It matters in sports. It matters in places where you're naked, vulnerable, competing physically, doing things that mean interacting, closely with other people. And if somebody can insist that they're the sex they're not, you come straight to the, liberty ends when your fist hits my nose sort of thing. The nose appears at that point. So straight away you are trampling on other people's rights. And I mean, that's what Sex Matters is about. It's about saying, what are sex-based rights? And how do we accommodate people who don't want to be thought about as the sex that they are in a world where there are still some accommodations that require us to recognise the sex of the people around us? And you need to think that through within a human rights framework. Like, what does that mean for birth certificates? What does that mean for intimate spaces? What does it mean for healthcare? And you can work them out in each of these places, but it certainly isn't that you can just declare yourself whichever sex you are and everyone else has to go along, because that destroys their rights. So you asked about things like transracialism or transageism and so on, and it's funny that it's just been sex and not the others. And then I come back to the fact that there are powerful men for whom the erotic fixation is to be women. There isn't an equivalent for the others. There isn't a really powerful, wealthy, absolutely obsessive contingent of white men who want nothing more than to be black. And the same for age. We'd all love to be younger, but we'd love it because, our hips would feel better and, we'd be more gorgeous, not actually just the thing that's written on the piece of paper. Do you know what I mean? There are people who are doing this. There are adults who do dress in nappies and children's clothes. There was a guy just a couple of weeks ago who was removed from a playground because he had turned up in a little girl's dress.
Gee, that sounds like something out of a horror movie.
With a dummy and a nappy and everything, and the police had to take him out because he says he's a little girl, he's 3. And again, that's an erotic fixation. So yeah, I mean, once you start saying that there's a human right to have other people, to force other people to say that you are what you're not, intellectually there's no stopping point. Intellectually it could be anything. But are there people who want to do it, is the question. And I would say mostly not. The sex is the specific one.
I mean, there have been 1 or 2 cases, I think, in America. Of
transracialism, yeah.
Yeah, of white women.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah. And then you think, well, why?
Themselves.
I mean, one reason is for advantage, because in American hiring and in universities and so on, there's quite a significant advantage to being black or Hispanic. But also because, we keep telling, especially in America, white kids that there's something wrong with being white. Like, it's very basic. It's very boring to be a cis-het white male. You know, so people identify as non-binary as the easiest thing that you can do here, like to not be basic. I mean, like kids, very large numbers of kids in schools now say that they're either pansexual or non-binary because they're both undisprovable. Like nothing actually is required of either of those, but they give you some freedom from this sense that, you know, within this sort of very identitarian intersectional model, you are not the person who's not allowed to speak. Like, you know, the sort of sit down, you know, you're a man, you sit down, you're white, you sit down. Like if you're all of those things, if you're all the bad things, cis het white male, for those who don't know, cis is the opposite of trans, like you're not allowed to speak at all, you've got no freedom of manoeuvre. So there's a temptation there to identify out of that, I suppose. In America, it's very taboo to identify out of whiteness. And again, it's just very, very hard to say why, intellectually, you should be allowed to identify out of maleness, which, you know, in the male-female hierarchy, male is the superior one, just as white is the superior one and black in that binary, you know. I'm being very simplistic here, but you know what I mean. So why are you allowed to identify out of maleness and into femaleness, but you aren't allowed to identify out of whiteness and into blackness? And I mean, I think there aren't people who are arguing for it for the last 100 years, is the big real reason. But intellectually, it's because the two are theorised in completely different ways. So sex and gender are theorised within queer theory, in which all boundaries are seen as bad things, definitions are there to be blurred, binaries are there to be overturned, hierarchies are dissolved, everything like that. Whereas race is theorised within critical race theory, in which the binary is the strictest thing imaginable and nothing.
Stay in your lane.
Stay in your lane, whiteness, like you can't identify out of whiteness. You can't even be forgiven for whiteness. Like according to Robin DiAngelo, you must do penance all of your life for being white. Right. So you mustn't be allowed to identify out of whiteness, because if you could, then you'd have to be able to identify out of doing the work.
Yeah, interesting. In the book, there's a very fascinating section on postmodernism and the influence you think this has had on transgender ideology, the notion of sort of deconstructing the binary, which you've just sort of touched on, the type of theory advanced by Judith Butler. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a philosopher and I'm not a historian of philosophy either. So, I mean, let's just sort of skip lightly to where I think it's got us, as opposed to do any sort of fair history of it, because I think it's an incredibly bastardized version of it now. You know, it's a sort of Tumblrized, flattened, you know, ridiculous version of what probably had some profundity to it. So, I mean, in your introduction, you said, you know, people who believe that words can be redefined or something like this, you know, to mean what they want to mean. But they kind of can, and words kind of do shape our reality. Like, you know...
Well, within limits.
Oh, but totally within limits. That was my next... But if you think, like, some words, when you say, with this ring I thee wed, you become married, like, it actually does something. It creates things like legal obligations. But when you say that somebody is, I think, what was I described as by the Master of Keys a couple of weeks ago, offensive, hateful, and something else, I forget what, you change reality by saying words like that. You get people to turn up and bang things outside you. You put people in danger. You know, you create hate by saying those sorts of words. So I think what happened in the postmodernist movement is they noticed, to some extent, they noticed how words do shape our reality. If you've no words for things and you can't say and describe them, you almost don't feel them sometimes. But they became intoxicated with this and maybe went too far, and this is where I'm not the historian of philosophy. So I think there was an observation there that was real and also very valuable. Like, there are lots of things that have been naturalised that weren't natural, like, you know, only opposite-sex marriage, women taking, you know, women under the direction of their husbands. Like, so to say what's natural, are these things natural that we think are natural? You know, is homosexuality unnatural? Do words describe reality or create reality? So, but these things have acted like a sort of a slow acid on our culture, and I think they've very definitely gone too far at the point at which it's hate speech to say we come in two sexes. You know, if you have two people on a desert island and those two people don't speak the same language or don't speak any language, You know, I'll be able to give you a fair old prediction about whether little new human beings are born by looking to see what sex those two people are. And it's not language that can shape that. Nothing I can say will change whether or not those people will make babies or not. And I think that's been thrown out. And I don't think it was by the original postmodernist philosophers. I think this is the 2015 Tumblr version of this nonsense, you know?
Well, I think from my understanding of them, that, you know, you go back to Foucault and all the kind of new left theorists who kind of abandoned classical Marxism, and then they sought to develop a new, updated, radical style of politics. They were seeking to challenge what they saw as being established bourgeois ideology and also traditional religious ideology, but they weren't denying metaphysical reality. And it seems to me that the big division here, which I mean, Ayn Rand used to write about man-made stuff which can be changed and which is the subject, the focus of ideological debate. But on the other hand, metaphysical reality which can't be changed.
It's just very
and that
hard
once
to know
you have an ideology that actually seeks to deny metaphysical reality, then you are in big trouble, it seems to me. And this is sort of where some elements of the left, the new left, for example, Extinction Rebellion have this slogan, demand the impossible.
Yeah, well,
that's going to end well,
but don't you think that one of the things that's happened over the, you know, if we go sort of over the whole of what we might call since the Industrial Revolution, is that we did things that we thought were impossible? Like, I often wonder, like, how have very ordinary people who aren't thinking about this hard, like, what do they think when they hear that sex is a spectrum, or that there are 3 sexes or 5 sexes, or that you can change sex? They know perfectly well that's not true. And then I think, like, how many things in my life have I been told that I thought weren't true, and then it turns out they are? You know, light is a wave and a particle. I still don't understand that, and I have a PhD in mathematics. You know, all these things that turned out to be possible that we thought weren't possible. So I think people, and I mean, really changing sex is not one of those things, and it's not likely to be one of those things anytime in the remotely near future. But how can you be sure if you're just an ordinary Joe who's trying to get on with your life? I think you must just see these things fly by in the rear view mirror and think, oh, they can do that now? That's surprising. All right then. You know, the high-ups are saying it's the case now.
Yeah. Leading on from that, transgenderism, like postmodernism, sounds superficially liberal, with a small L, sort of epistemologically anarchic, sort of let it all hang out, you can be anything you want to be. But within it, it seems to me, there is, especially if that idea is sort of politicized, a highly authoritarian logic to it, because it does then imply that you can restructure society on the basis of ideology and control of language, and that the task then is to transfer this sort of extraordinary power to a supposedly enlightened elite who will do it for us. And then they will ban all types of speech under the guise of it being hateful.
I mean, it's an extraordinarily linguistic movement. Like, to say that you become a woman or that you reveal that you always were a woman by saying that you're a woman. Like, it's all about utterance, which is very postmodern. But if you say things and other people must believe them, you are not just reordering reality, or maybe you aren't reordering reality. What you're doing is you're forcing other people to lie, to pretend. And because it is a lie, a man cannot become a woman, a male person cannot be female. If you build that in, that they're entitled to do and say that, what you're doing, even though you're not saying it at the time, is you're building in that it's one person's right to force the entire rest of humanity to see something they don't see, or at least say they see something they don't see. And if you do that, I mean, it's highly illiberal, but it's also going to require major policing of speech. Because actually it's very innate to us to see what sex other people are. I mean, it would be very surprising if it wasn't. it's obviously important reproduction from the reproductive point of view. So the idea that it would not have evolved into us to have a very instinctive and instinctual perception of other people's sex is absurd. And actually there's good evidence that women are better at spotting sex than men are. Much quicker, from fewer cues. There's all these tests where you pixelate pictures, or you just show people. There's a fascinating one. You just get, I think it's 8 dots of light. And those 8 dots of light, what they are is I think it's the elbows, the shoulders, the hips and the knees of somebody walking, or maybe it's 10 and you've got the ankles as well. And all you see is those walking, and you can easily straight away see whether it's a man or a woman. And it's just an animation, right? But women see these things quicker than men. So why? Well, men are stronger and men rape and men are dangerous and women have to be picky. And this is true right across the animal kingdom. This is not a statement about humans. Women are much pickier in terms of mates than men are, because the investment of a pregnancy and so on is a much bigger investment than, one ejaculation. So women notice when there's a man around much faster. I'm talking about milliseconds difference, because it's a very quick thing for both sexes. Then men notice what sex other people are. And men tend to go on sort of what we might say more sort of large scale cues. So, if it's got high heels on and it's got tits and it's wearing lipstick, a man is more likely to go, yeah, all right, fine. Looks like a woman to me, And women are going are you kidding? There's a million things that makes this person not look like a woman. So I think that's one of the undersung reasons why there's a difference here. Like some men, I want us to pick up this point. Women are actually more keen on transgender ideology than men are in polls. So I'm not trying to say that this is all an imposition of men on women, but let's just talk about the very aggressive trans rights activists who do tend to be men, whether they're men who identify as women.
Trans Antifa type people.
Exactly. So I think one of the differences is that some of those men, at least, are just think it's a bit mean of us. They think that she looks like a woman to me, or she'll do, it's all right. I mean, I don't want her in the men's loos. It doesn't look like a man to me. And we're going still looks like a man to me. And there's that perception difference. So yeah, I mean, it's not something that's very easy to force other people to lie about, because it's so innate that you recognise it.
So do you think that part of the drive to restrict freedom of speech in this area, to actually limit debate, because Stonewall and these kind of groups say they don't believe there should be any debate on principle, that even to articulate a different view is to commit a human rights violation and all that sort of stuff.
They're intimately connected, because this is a speech policing movement.
But is part of that they can't actually risk a debate, because this is fundamentally a movement that is based on faith, on people revealing some sort of inner truth that can't be empirically verified, justified. So they kind of inherently know this is nonsense. It's based on sort of fantastical foundations, but for other political, or maybe in some cases sexual, or whatever it is, psychological reasons, there is a group of people who want to adhere to this ideology and impose it, but they can't actually afford the rest of society to challenge it intellectually.
So I agree with you half. I don't agree that the reason that they don't want debate is they know they'd lose, or they know that it's ridiculous. I think that's too simple. I think they do at least sort of believe it. I think that they think...
So why are they bothered about you or anybody else saying we don't?
Because they are absolutist theists. It's a religion. This is a religion without a god. Okay, I shouldn't have called it I shouldn't have said theist. This is a faith-based movement,
right?
And the faith is that we have inner selves, and those inner selves are sexed, and the sex can be different from the body. That's a proposition that's not open to any sort of scientific or intellectual inquiry. It's just a proposition. It's like saying, 3 gods in one, or after 3 days he rose again. There's no debate to be had about whether God is 3 spirits in one. It's not that sort of thing. So I think there's that they don't see any point in debate from their point of view. This is a faith-based statement. But then I keep coming back to the fact that it's a very linguistic movement and it requires the policing of other people's language. That's why they don't want debate, and that's why they're angry with somebody like me. It's like going to the mullahs in Iran and saying, look, what's it to you if the women don't want to wear scarves? Like, you believe one thing, they believe another thing. No, they're absolutists. They're as bad as the mullahs.
Yeah. So, I mean, we are, I think, beginning to see the kind of emergence of a new morality police in this country, where the police can turn up now, put you on a non-crime hate database because they know they couldn't get a conviction, but you're put on a list of people who hold, according to the police, an unacceptable view, even though it's a legal one. So it's an amazing kind of weird situation.
But humanity has always done this. You know, what's weird is that we had this brief period where we tried to find ways in which two people, I mean, I don't know, you know, if there are 10 people in a room, probably all 10 of them now in a city like London believe fundamentally incompatible things. I mean, I'm from a Catholic family and I'm an atheist, but I mean, we don't argue about it when I go home, because our idea, this painfully one idea, is that we live in a liberal, secular democracy. And that means freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of belief. And that means tolerance even of things you find hateful and wrong. I remember a religious friend of mine saying something about, you know, he'd pray for my soul or something like that. And I said, well, I don't think I have a soul. And he said, yes, but God doesn't worry about that. And I said, I don't think you've got a soul either. And the pair of us just laughed and got on with it, you know. So I believed that neither of us have souls, and he believes that both of us have souls, and we both of us just go along with it. But that's not usual in human history. Usually, that's off to the tumbrils with you.
Yeah, but I think we probably thought in Western Europe that we'd kind of got past that with the Enlightenment and all. And actually, what's interesting to see that we're kind of moving, I think, in a regressive way. There's nothing progressive about this.
We're not protecting it. Like, these things are precious, and they were very hard won, and they're very easily lost. And we are not taking at all seriously enough how important these things are, like how important it is that people do not say horrible things about people who are just trying to speak, even if you disagree with them. It's really hard to listen to people saying things that strike at your identity. I know that. So I know that people don't want to hear it, and they've been told that their feelings about how it feels to listen to someone like me speak when you fundamentally disagree with me, they've been told that those feelings license calling me hateful and trying to silence me, and that's moral and good. But actually, that's just, you know...
But then that's a pathway to a terrifying kind of society where people can, you know, smash you in the face or
lock you
worse
up
because you have a different view. I mean, if you don't have that self-denying movement, then liberal democracy is impossible.
Absolutely. And the thing they do first, it isn't smash you in the face and it isn't lock you up, it's try to lose you your job. So if you look back at past sinkings into illiberalism, so, you know, the run-up to the Third Reich, for example, why did people join a Nazi party before it was clear really where it was going, but when it was pretty clear the kind of place it was going? And why did the kids join Hitler Youth? It's because their parents were worried about their jobs if they didn't. People do these things to save their jobs because we don't like to starve. We don't want to be out in the street. We don't want to lose our homes. We want to be able to look after our children. So all of this is policed through work more than anything else. It's HR departments. It's the put your pronouns in your email signature. And you think like, oh, it's stupid. Like, everybody knows I'm a woman or everybody knows I'm a man, but why would I rock the boat? And you know, because you've seen it in the papers, you've seen that there have been people who've been fired over this sort of stuff. So you stay quiet. And before you know it, we're back to a morality police.
Which brings me on to my last question. Obviously, J.K. Rowling, Maya Forstater, yourself and others have led a sort of fantastically courageous pushback against this ideology and its illiberal imposition on our society. But how do you see things going now, and what happens if legally, politically speaking, this movement just carries on advancing? You do get you know, automatic self-identification, as now is sort of about to happen, I gather, in Scotland, but then that will have implications for the rest of the UK. If you get a government that wants to legislate for this, plus other stuff, what do people like you and those of us who, have a profound desire to be able to say what we think on this, not be forced to use pronouns we don't want to use, we don't want mandated speech. What do we do?
I mean, I think it's all to play for still here, because we've actually got a pretty good human rights framework in our law. And there are, we do have rights to freedom of speech and freedom of belief, and those things do offer us protections that are testable in court, even if they bring in things like the hate speech legislation and the non-misgendering and so on, So there's an awful lot to keep fighting for, and I think it's going to be house to house for quite a while. I think it's going to have to be using things like religious teachers who refuse to use incorrectly sexed pronouns for kids and get sacked, and they have to go to employment tribunals and claim that it's a protected belief, and all that sort of thing. So there's going to be years of court cases, years of people being sued, judicial reviews, all that sort of thing. I mean, that's in our future. But suppose we lose, I think was the question you're asking. Suppose we lose.
Yeah, in the short term, medium term, this gets worse.
So, I mean, there are people who are quite seriously looking at just removing sex as a concept entirely in law. So there was a 4-year research project at King's College London. They got several £100,000 in a government grant. And this is just one of many, many government grants for this sort of stuff. And it's being funded by charities and NGOs and so on as well, and think tanks. And their theory is, it's so stupid that I still find it hard to say these things. Their theory is that we will end sexism if it becomes impossible to say anything or record anything about sex. I'm sorry, it'll only be impossible to talk about it, that's all. So their idea is to get rid of sex on birth certificates and to remove any legal rights or obligations of any sort from the concept of sex. So, maternity right will become parental rights, parental leave. There might be a sort of an unspoken acceptance that there's one of you who might have to head off to the hospital for a bit and might not quite be able to return to the shop floor the next day.
Referred to as a person who gives birth or something.
Yes, and that would be very detached. And I mean, this is all related to, the transhumanist idea that we'll be fixing ourselves and become immortal and become cyborgs and so on. And on the way there, we'll be using surrogates. Like there's even this move to call, if two gay men want to have a baby, to say the sort of infertility that they have is situational infertility. And there's a legal case underway in New York to get one of the couple is trying to get his health insurers to pay for the surrogate and the egg on the grounds that he's in the same situation as a woman whose, fallopian tubes are blocked or something like that. Situationally infertile as opposed to medically infertile. So this way of thinking, it's very, very, very powerful, and it's in the air, and it was going for decades before any of us really noticed that we needed to push back against it. And what happens when a theocratic state starts? Each person has to decide themselves what they're going to do, don't they? I mean, look at those women in Iran who had their heads bare in the 1970s. They put on headscarves, didn't they? And here they are taking them off again and getting beaten and shot for it. Do I think that happens here? Not exactly. You decide, don't you? You decide whether you're going to put the pronouns in your email signature or whether you're just going to say no and go to jail and try and make a cause célèbre of it. Hopefully we won't get there here. We can show the world that it's possible to accommodate people who deny the reality of sex. I do want to say just something which, this thing about the difference between the sexes. This is, if you ask in opinion polls, it's women rather than men who say that they agree with transgender ideology, like by about 10 percentage points, and it's larger numbers when they're younger. And it's a bit of a puzzle because it's more harmful, very obviously more harmful for women than for men. And I think it's a mixture of younger women not realising that. Women do tend to get radicalised by the experience of having children. And before that, you like to think that you're the same as the men and it won't make any difference. And then you have a child and you realise that the world is not half fixed. You thought it was, but it isn't. Women not liking to say, this is going to affect me badly because I'm physically weaker, I can be raped, pretty much any man could overpower me. These are not pleasant things to think about, so I think it's easier to deny them for a lot of people. And then a sort of a very sanctimonious kind of one-upmanship that people can be prone to, that you're so kind and so generous. It's like being a white person who's pro racial preferences in American universities. You know, it's such a virtue signal because obviously it hurts
Yeah.
you. You're such a good person. So I don't actually think very highly of this sort of argument, but it is just a fact that it is women who are imposing this on women more than men.
Helen Joyce, thank you so much for joining me. Utterly fascinating.
Well, thank you for having me.
Hope you've enjoyed it.
Yes.
And thank you very much. And your book, again, last plug for it. I mean, it is a truly fantastic book, very thought-provoking, and a fantastic kind of comprehensive analysis and introduction to this issue.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.